You are a respectable person in 1600s Europe and you have a headache. So you go to the apothecary, the same as you would today, and you hand over your coins, and the man behind the counter measures out your remedy from a jar. The remedy is powdered human skull. This is not witchcraft. It is not a back alley cure sold by a criminal. It is mainstream medicine prescribed by respected physicians, stocked in ordinary shops, and swallowed by kings, popes, and gentlemen without a second thought. For something like 200 years, the polite, educated, church-going people of Europe treated the human corpse as one of the most powerful medicines available, and they ate it. This is the story of corpse medicine and of how an entire civilization talked itself into cannibalism and called it healthcare. Start with the strangest and most famous ingredient of all, mummy. Somewhere along the way, European doctors had got hold of the idea that the preserved flesh of an ancient Egyptian corpse was a potent drug. Good for bruising, for internal bleeding, for coughs, for almost anything. The demand became so intense that it created its own supply chain, running all the way to the tombs of Egypt, where the ancient dead were dug up, broken apart, and shipped to Europe to be ground into brown powder. And then, inevitably, the real mummies started to run short. So, the trade did what desperate trades always do. It faked the product. Merchants took the fresh bodies of the recently dead, executed criminals, the poor, people who had died of disease, dried them, treated them, and sold them as ancient Egyptian mummy to buyers who could not tell the difference. Meaning that a wealthy European, reaching for the finest medicine money could buy, might well have been swallowing a stranger who had died the month before, a few towns over. And mummy was only the beginning of the menu. Powdered human skull was prescribed for ailments of the head and for fits, on the old logic that like should cure like. A disease of the head, answered by a medicine of the head. The most prized skulls of all were said to be those of young men who had died violently and been left unburied, because their vital force was thought to be still trapped inside, uncorrupted. Healers would even scrape the greenish moss that grew on such skulls and grind that into medicine too. Human fat was rendered down and rubbed onto aching joints and wounds, and executioners did a quiet side trade selling the fat of the criminals they had put to death. And then there was blood. Fresh human blood, ideally warm, ideally from a healthy young body, was drunk as a cure for epilepsy. And at public executions in some parts of Europe, sufferers would gather at the scaffold with cups in their hands, waiting to pay the headsman for a draft straight from the newly dead. The gallows was not only a place of punishment, it was a pharmacy. This all went right to the top of society. One English king kept a personal recipe for a medicine distilled from powdered human skull steeped in alcohol, a preparation so associated with him that it took his name, and he was said to dose himself with it happily. Physicians wrote about these remedies in serious medical texts, debated the best methods of preparation, and argued over which corpses made the strongest medicine, the way a modern journal might argue over a drug trial. Nobody involved thought of themselves as a monster. They thought of themselves as scientific. And that is the part that should stop you, because these were not stupid people or cruel people. They were operating a coherent, confident, respectable medical system. And that system told them that the human body was full of a kind of borrowed life, and that you could take that life into yourself to heal what ailed. The most extraordinary story in the whole tradition sits right at its outer edge, and it may be more legend than fact, but it was told and retold for centuries as though it were real. It described an old man in his final years who would eat nothing but honey and bathe in nothing but honey until honey was all that his body contained. When he died, his corpse was placed in a stone coffin filled with more honey and sealed for many years until the body itself had steeped and transformed into a kind of confection, and that, what the accounts call a mellified man, was then broken off in small pieces and taken as a rare and precious medicine for broken bones and injuries. Whether any such thing ever truly happened almost does not matter. The point is that people believed it could happen and wanted it to be true because it was the purest expression of the whole idea. A human being, slowly and deliberately turned into a cure to be eaten. Now, here is the twist that ties it all together, and it is a sharp one. At the very same time that educated Europeans were spooning powdered corpse into their tea, those same Europeans were sailing to distant lands, meeting peoples they did not understand, and recoiling in horror at the savages and cannibals they claimed to find there. They used that word, cannibal, as one of the deepest insults they had, a mark of everything uncivilized and damned. And they used it while carrying in their own coat pockets little tins of dried human flesh bought from a chemist. The difference, in their minds, was not the eating of human bodies. Both did that. The difference was the packaging. Theirs came ground into powder, labeled in Latin, sold across a polished counter, and prescribed by a man with a medical education. Distance and paperwork had turned the one act every culture claims to forbid into a line item on an apothecary's shelf. The trade faded slowly over the 1700s as medicine changed and tastes shifted, though echoes of it lingered far longer than you would expect. Ground mummy was still being sold, at times as medicine and at times even as a brown pigment for artists' paint, well into the 1800s. But it did not vanish because someone proved it was cannibalism. Everyone already knew what it was. It faded because the underlying belief faded, the belief that a corpse still holds a usable spark of the person it had been, a spark you could swallow and keep. And if you strip the powdered skulls and the honeyed corpses away, that belief is not really so foreign. It is one of the oldest instincts our species has, that the dead have power and that the living might take it. Most cultures dress that instinct up in ritual and keep it at arm's length. Europe, for a couple of 100 years, dressed it up in a physician's Latin and a chemist's jar and swallowed it whole. That is the thread this channel keeps pulling on. The moment where a belief we would call monstrous today was simply the ordinary, respectable common sense of its time. If you want more of the history that got quietly left out of the textbook, subscribe. No corpses required.